So as the season of Easter comes to its conclusion, next Sunday we'll enter into the season of Pentecost as we celebrate the day of Pentecost. So we get a little bit of a precursor in the first reading that Michelle read for us from the book of Acts. We get a little sense of what is going to happen as we hear certain words from Jesus about the Holy Spirit and power and just setting the disciples up for what is going to come. But as a part of that, we hear a couple of little interesting things. We hear that Jesus was at a certain place with the disciples about a Sabbath day journey from Jerusalem. So a Sabbath day journey would take us back to some of those Old Testament laws that were then sort of expanded on. And you could only take so many steps on a Sabbath before it would begin to feel like work. And because you couldn't work on a Sabbath, there was a limited number of steps that you could take. Well, they were that many steps away from Jerusalem. And although we don't get it in the very beginning of the book of Acts, we did hear at the end of the Gospel of Luke this little village where all of this, the ascension, takes place. Anybody want to guess the name of that little village? Bethany. Yes, it happened all in Bethany. And so that's what we have as a part of kind of setting this up. Just as Luke, as he's writing this second narrative, the book of Acts, sets up for us so we understand how all of this is coming together. And then as we hear that, again, Jesus comes and he says to the people that when the Holy Spirit comes, they will receive power. That becomes really important to them. But what I find so funny about all that, they've just been told they're going to have all this power, everything's going to happen. And what do after Jesus ascends into heaven? They just stand there and look. Until finally, two men stand beside him and ask him, "Why are you staring into heaven? What do you think's going to happen right now? Jesus already told you, now's the time for you to go to work." And so now they sort of might realize that this is their time. And so they head away from Bethany into Jerusalem, probably back into the same place where they had celebrated the Passover with Jesus not very long ago, just 6 weeks prior. And so now they are there again. And Jesus has told them, and if we go back probably at some point along the way, Matthew tells us that Jesus had already met them in Galilee, told them that they're to go to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That probably would have happened prior. And now we have Luke telling us that Jesus is sharing with them that they're going to get this power. And so knowing all of that, knowing everything that Jesus would want you to do, let's just stare into heaven for a while. And then after that, when somebody tells us we shouldn't be staring into heaven anymore, let's just go back to Jerusalem and do what? Go into a room by ourselves. That sounds like a great plan. So let's just sequester ourselves some more. Now we think we're doing all the work we're supposed to because we're praying. That only goes so far, if we're just in that room praying, and we should leave it right there and say, come back next week because the story will continue. But I'm not going to tell you what happens to them, but I do want to tie in a little bit about what happens from our gospel reading for today. Because this isn't completely disassociated to what might have been happening there. In our gospel reading, we hear, this is after Jesus has preached to the crowd, so he goes up on the mountain by himself to pray, tells the disciples, you go hang out in the boat, I'll catch up with you. I don't know if they asked how, but they just got into the boat, and then the storm came up, and they're taken out into the sea, and in the morning, Jesus comes to them walking on the water. And so now, in the midst of all of that, it's the fright of seeing a person walking on the water to you, but Peter, being bold enough to say, if it's you, Lord, if that's really you, command me to come out onto the water. I like the way Peter does that. Command me to come out on the water. And so Jesus says, one word, come. And so Peter does. Peter goes out onto the water, walking toward him. And now things get a little difficult. He notices that in the midst of walking on the water, the wind is still very strong, and he gets frightened. And when he gets frightened, he begins to sink. And that's the point that Jesus reaches out with a hand and asks him this funny little question: why did you doubt? Why would you doubt? I've never tried to walk on water unless you count a frozen lake, but I don't really count that in the same kind of way. But I'm not sure that I would have been so sure of myself walking out on the water that I wouldn't have been a person of a little bit of doubt in all of that. So I'm wondering, where else do I live with too much doubt? Where else do I decide it's easier to just stare into heaven and wait for Jesus to come back and take care of it all? Or where do I decide it's really way more comfortable in the boat than out in the midst of the wind and the waves? And I realize that all of that becomes a part of how I live my life. I live too much of my life staring into heaven and staying in the boat. And I very rarely say to Jesus, if you really want me to go do something, Jesus, command me to do it. And I wonder if I ask Jesus, will you command me to go do this thing? If I would believe that Jesus gives the power that was promised to the disciples standing on that mountain. Do I really believe God would give me that kind of power? And in my head, I believe it. And my heart loves to doubt it. So I wonder sometimes, if I asked Jesus, what would he command me to do? I mean, Jesus, would you command me to actually have an open, honest conversation with my neighbor? That sounds really easy, but she had a Biden sign in her yard a few years ago. Or he had a Trump sign in his yard a few years ago. Or they have a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard, and I don't know how to talk to that person. But Jesus, if you command me, I'll attempt it. And Jesus says to me, no, just stay in the boat. No, of course not. Of course not. Jesus doesn't say, I wouldn't do that, just stare into heaven for a while. Of course not. That's not what Jesus would tell us to do. Or if we wanted to volunteer someplace at Metro Caring, if one day just like stocking shelves and maybe another day out on the line, might be another day doing financial counseling, would it seem like we don't have the right kind of power to be able to do that kind of thing? But Jesus, if you really want me to volunteer that way, will you command me to do so? I think we all know what Jesus would tell us to do. If we wanted to actually invite somebody else to worship, somebody that didn't look like us or act like us or think like us, and know that there was a place where we could be together in a wholesome community, supporting one another, even in the midst of our diversity. If we said, Jesus, could you give me the kind of power it would take to invite someone like that to worship? Jesus would say, go invite them. And we would realize that in the midst of that, we would be in a potentially very uncomfortable situation because we might not feel totally prepared for it. And in the midst of that, we would say, but what if? What if I attempt to go do that and I start sinking? What if I would go attempt to have that conversation, to serve somebody in need, to invite somebody into a community where they will be accepted? What happens if I get so scared that I begin to sink? I also think we know Jesus would say, I'm not very far away. I'll reach out my hand, and it's going to be just fine. And so I realize that there are many times in the midst of my week where I don't really even have the courage to say to Jesus, command me to go do this, because I'm afraid Jesus might say, go do this. And so I don't even want to ask because I kind of already know what Jesus might answer. So it's really easier to sometimes, maybe far too often, decide that I'd rather just sit here and stare into heaven. Because sooner or later, Jesus will come back and take care of all of this for me. Sometimes I'll realize it's a lot easier to just kind of be in the company of my friends, really nice people like you, and we can be in a beautiful sanctuary in a very safe place all together here, and forget that Jesus promised a power that goes beyond this place. Some Sundays I think it is so nice to just be here with all of you, to just have this time together. It's like we're all in the same boat, staring into heaven. And then I wonder, will anybody actually have faith enough to step out of the boat?